the results. It should be right here. Okay, yeah, so the first response was about, before the Enlightenment, knowledge was controlled by whom? And we see a lot of people getting correct. That is, it was the Catholic Church or the Church. Sometimes people are saying governments.
0.
Wait.
Albert Einstein.
Yeah, so that's, again, this is answers for all three periods. Under absolutist monarchies, publishing or reading a book that was considered dangerous could have this consequence. The book is burned, you're imprisoned, you're excommunicated from the church, or all the above. So before books, or actually I shouldn't say before books, because of books, the powers that be were very threatened. Let me go back to... Right. And when people were able to buy and read books which contained this so-called dangerous knowledge, this led to an expansion of the idea of individual rights. And eventually political systems like democracy, constitutional monarchy, equality before the law, and again, most of you got this correct, all of the above. So this is the power of books. Books are so dangerous that people who are in charge are willing to imprison people or worse, and they're willing to threaten them, and they're willing to destroy the book. That's how dangerous this object is. And I want to connect what we're learning about in the past to the present. So I want to ask, when you were a child, did you learn more from books or devices? This is when you were a child. Vast majority of you, yeah? Say books. Books is what was helping you. But now that you're a young adult, do you learn more from books or devices? Vast majority said devices. Almost the same ratio, right? So something has changed in your lifetime. You've gone from using books and now you're using devices. We'll talk a little more about how each are different. First by asking, do you even read books that you're not assigned in school? And it looks like that ratio has improved. In earlier classes it was a bit more dramatic. But still, the majority of you, if you're not assigned a book, you're not going to be reading it. So we've really become quite device-centered. And say, what was the longest book you've ever read? This is kind of a neat spread. I've seen this all day. Some of us are relatively low in page count. But once you go up to about 250 pages, it looks like it's about a quarter or so, about a third. And 2/3 of, or 3/4 of us or so have read very, very long books, I would say. So I'm just kind of curious to ask the room of people who have read 500-page books. Anybody, can you tell me what genre they were?
Romance.
Romance? I've heard mystery as well. Fantasy, yep. Science fiction. Religious text, yep. So I had a student in another class say the Bible itself, right?
Twilight, like dark romance or something? Dark.
Khalil? Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Long books that they've read? Any genres that we haven't covered? So mostly all these longer texts are really good stories. There's a lot going on, a lot of characters. They kind of draw you out. They they hold your attention. So devices, which we now are mostly dependent on, allow us to store information easily and recall it with search skills. So how strong are your search and research abilities? It's a question I ask all periods. Very consistent response. All of you feel, at a minimum, you're neutral, but many of you feel that you're very strong in your search abilities. And I can confirm this. So on Friday, I gave you an interactive worksheet where you were filling it out. I was grading it at the same time, coming back, giving you feedback. Over the weekend, I finished the grading. It took me all the way until third period today. So your teacher worked overtime, unpaid labor. But now you all have individual comments on what you wrote or how you answered the question. I strongly encourage you, and for the rest of the period after this is done, you'll be going back to that document, looking at where you can improve. This will benefit you for not just this unit test, but the rest of the class. But I agree, you all have very strong research skills. If you are given a question and there is a definite answer and you have to use a text to find that answer, all of you know how to do that very well. It is like unusual, at least from my perspective. That level of comfort with, I got to find the answer, let me go search for it, let me figure it out. I think it's the devices. I think it's years of using something where you had to figure out how to Google an answer. But when I ask in the books where there's no find search feature, how easily are you able to remember where information is located? And this has become quite a beautiful, what's called a bell curve or a normal distribution of data. The majority of you, the mode of the data, say that you're neutral. A decent number say, high or low. I feel more or less confident about it. And very few are on the extremes that say, I definitely don't know how to find information in the book, or I definitely do. Literally 3 out of 90. But when you do search for information in the book, what helps you remember where it was located? This is my tribe, visually, where it was located on the page. When I used to write essays in college and I would have a stack of 10 books that I was citing for my argument, I would remember where a quote was on a page, and I would flip through the book to find that quote, but it wasn't dependent on chapter or what the subject was. But that's what these folks are saying, that they can remember generally where a chapter is or a section. This part here, how far into a book, chapter, or section, I remember seeing it. That's kind of like how far in the book was it. I think it was halfway, somewhere around there. Kind of a visual. And then this last piece is interesting. This is more of like someone who can remember something because of how it was connected to other things. And that's finding other sections of the reading being close. So a good number of people in all these different categories. It's good knowledge to have. Difference again between devices and books. Devices allow us to store information so we do not have to memorize. So I thought of a nice normal question. What's something that normal people have to memorize? Phone numbers. And about 40% of us know about 1 or 2 phone numbers, and that's it. Like if you were in an emergency situation, you knew your parents maybe, you know your home number, maybe you know your own. That's the limit. Once you add in up to about 5 numbers, now the vast majority of us know, probably 3 to 5. That might include our significant other, our best friend, something like that. And then very few of us know 5 to 10, extremely few of us know more than 10. That's very interesting. I did not expect that. So I saw this happen in my lifetime. Cell phones didn't exist when I started high school. They did when I finished. And we all memorized each other's phone numbers. So we would go home after school, we'd pick up the phone, and we would dial each other, and our friends' parents would pick up the phone, even if it was your boyfriend or girlfriend, so that was always kind of a fun conversation. And then the phone would be handed over to the person you wanted to reach. Then cell phones came out, and then we didn't even think that this was going to happen. But about 5 years into owning cell phones, we all forgot each other's numbers. They just left. We didn't have to memorize it anymore. You see what I'm saying? So this is one example of how when something new comes along, a new method of communicating information, it can change how you remember information. It can change what knowledge is. In a fancy academic term, this is an epistemic shift. So devices are highly interactive while books are passive objects. How long into reading until you get distracted? I actually thought this was going to be much more disproportionate on the short end. Almost immediately, it's really not that big of a slice. 1 to 2 minutes here, 3 to 5 minutes here. Now we're up to about a quarter of us within 5 minutes are getting distracted. When you go up to 15, it's about half of us. You can go about 15 minutes into a book. When you go up to 30 minutes, now it's 2/3 of us. And then there's about 1/4 of us or fewer who can go up to an hour or even comfortably sit for a long period with a book. Maybe those are the people who read 500-page books. Okay, this gets to Ms. Ari's point, you were asking earlier about how do I know the answer if there's not a page number and so on, right? So worksheets include questions that require search and answer skills. We talked about that earlier. Everyone's very strong on those. But also, worksheets talk about questions that are more abstract, thoughtful, or require inference. Inference is when you don't quite know what the answer is. You have to sort of puzzle it. You have to figure it out. How strong are your abilities to think about a question that doesn't have a right answer? Again, kind of a normal distribution, just much more peaked. So many more of you are like, well, I'm going to be neutral on this one. I don't want to say I'm strong or weak. But again, fairly even distribution on either side. And it's kind of neat that that's the same distribution as the question of how do I find information in a book? You see what I mean? It doesn't have a find feature. How do I find the information? Let's see. So the final question then was about an inference. And I was encouraging you to think about how you live in revolutionary times. You know, back 300, 400 years ago, the invention of the book brought down kings. It ended the church, outlawed, all the powerful people got rounded up and put in jails, all because of a book. Many books, books with ideas, dangerous ideas, freedom, the freedom of thought, the freedom of speech, hard-earned, violent struggle on the streets, right? That's what we've been learning about for the last 2 weeks, is how the power of information being unleashed onto a people can cause great, powerful structures to crumble. And what I think is fascinating is that you all live through another age of revolution. The books are going out, and now the phones are in. And what's interesting about the phones is it's updated constantly. It's connected constantly all over the world. So instead of the world being something that you have to learn about, you are an active participant in just by having the thing. If you're on Instagram or social media of some sort, right? You can produce content, and if you're lucky, so to speak, although fame is kind of a double-edged sword, you could be famous tomorrow. It sometimes happens. The examples maybe pop to mind, So I just wanted you all to think about that knowledge is changing because of your phones. You no longer have to memorize as much information. The power of searching for information is much more important than the power of knowing things, right? But let me give you an example of why it's good to know things. The old school way, defending the old school. Are you familiar with Lord of the Rings? Some people, a couple people. So Lord of the Rings was written by a guy who was an Anglo-Saxon professor. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon. He was at Oxford, a very nice institution, and his job was to know all the myths of Anglo-Saxon culture, of Celtic culture. He also knew myths of German and Norwegian and Icelandic cultures that they all kind of came from. So he was the guy. You could go up to him in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, and you could ask him a question on any of those subjects, and he had an answer because he read a bunch of books and he memorized a bunch of information. He didn't have the internet. What this fella did at night was tell stories to his son in bed, just make up fanciful fairy tales. And some of the stories he told involved a little hobbit walking around the woods and so on. And that became the book, The Hobbit. And then later he wrote The Lord of the Rings. And it was all because in his head, he had this enormous amount of information that was similar. These cultural stories, these archetypes, these mythologies were similar. So when you read Tolkien, you're basically reading a kind of remixed version of the cultures of the North Sea, all spun up together. And that can only happen inside of one person's head because that person is memorized and has all this information. Also, that style of knowledge, of sitting with information, processing it independently, that's what makes you stronger at inference. And not just needing to have, where's the right answer? Where's the book? How do I find the answer if I don't? You won't have that requirement. So what I'm strongly encouraging in this class is we will be doing a lot of here's the question, here's the answer kind of exercises. That's good for knowing the facts. But I also want us to keep pushing a little bit so that we can start to interpret information. And in the field of history, you're really going to need it. And just like I talked earlier about, the French Revolution is a time of high ideals and really low violent action. Equality for all, and at the same time, there's these horrific systems of jailing people and executing people. There was slavery ongoing at the same time as conversations about everyone's free. So how does that work, right? In America as well as France. So what I mean is for you to process those contradictions in the field and really feel comfortable knowing history, these skill sets will be important. So that's kind of what's informing me as I design this unit assessment. We're going to do an end of unit test. It's going to be a big old test. Hopefully it won't be scary. You'll all be prepared for it. So the best way you can prepare for it by the end of the period, we got about 20 minutes or so, is look over all of the comments that I provided for you on your Friday worksheet. For the first one that talked about why was Napoleon loved by the people, almost every person that I wrote a comment on, I said, think about how he made a bargain with the Catholic Church. Now, it wasn't just because that was one important detail of a whole list. It's because think about what that represents. You just went through a big bloody conflict in your society, and part of that was that the church was banned. General man comes in, he's in charge, and one of the bargains he strikes is he says, we're bringing the church back. So think about what that represents for people, how that represents stability, you know? So these are the kind of connections I'm hoping to draw. So look at those comments, see if you can kind of rewrite your questions. It's only gonna help you for the final assessment. And then otherwise I'll put on some chill music and something visual to look at, and we'll have the rest of the period for your work. Thank you for your time.